Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today we're talking about
Cynicism as a philosophy of life. And this is a word that a lot of people throw around. It's got a lot of different meanings to it. If, Dan, when I say you're such a cynic, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
usually like pessimistic.
Okay.
Yeah. That or like maybe a little bit nihilistic.
Yeah, and we'll talk about what these terms mean. I was actually, as we were getting ready for the show, thinking about, there's a song I've heard somewhere that talks about this, and I realized that it's a Styx song, Fooling Yourself, and it starts out, the very first line is, you see the world through your cynical eyes. You're a troubled young man, I can tell. Of course, when they sang that, everybody who was a young man at the time is now an old man, just like the band is. And the line for the chorus goes, you're fooling yourself if you don't believe it. You're kidding yourself if you don't believe it. What are they supposed to believe? Well, the earlier verse is, you've got it all in the palm of your hand, but your hand's wet with sweat and your head needs a rest. So life, it kind of sucks, even though it doesn't really suck. And I think that's what a lot of people think of as cynicism today, right?
Yeah, it's just kind of a general, I feel like everyone goes through a little bit of that, like maybe in their early 20s or something, when you go from, you get out of your house and all these things that seem so easy and straightforward and kind of black and white, they start to become more and more gray.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, this nice ordered world that we thought we had is not as easy to put into little boxes.
Yeah, things are way more complicated, and there's always like a form that has to be filled out, or you should have paid this deposit, or things like that. I don't know that everybody goes through that, though. I mean, I've run into people who were, like when I was in college, who were in their 20s, and they were still very, very naive and Pollyannish, and everything is wonderful. They're clearly not cynics, right?
No. But doesn't mean that they won't be at some point in time.
Yeah, we should say for our listeners, too, that we're not advocating that kind of cynicism. We are going to talk a little bit about it because it's part of the culture, but we're proposing that you think about an earlier conception of cynicism, which I don't have any problem calling, in some respects, more authentic or closer to the source, because, that's where the word got its coinage, right, from the ancient cynics. So, but we should start by talking about what cynicism means today, which is, kind of a generalized mistrust or distrust of other people and their motivations or organizations or politics, or pick whatever you want. Sort of like the guy who said, whatever you got, I'm against it, And I think that one of the key parts of it is this, things can't be as good as you're making them out to be. I'm going to peel back the mask and reveal the true state of things, which is that, everybody's bad deep inside, including myself. And that's why I get to say it, because I'm not being a hypocrite. I think that's the way that we understand cynics today, right?
Okay, Holden. Sorry. Obviously, a Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye as a reference therein.
For those who didn't get assigned that back in high school and go through their own everybody's a phony phase.
Right. But I'm the phoniest of them all.
Well, that's interesting. At the risk of taking a digression, is there, if you're going to be a phony or you're going to be cynical about stuff, is it better to be worse off than everybody else if you're going to be criticizing them? Because then you can say, I really understand this badness.
Well, this kind of, to bring us back to ancient philosophy, sounds a lot like our good friend, teacher of Plato, Socrates, who says, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. So he's going out and asking all these people, what do you believe? Or what are how do you define virtue? How do you define goodness? And all these things. And he's just saying, I can't define it. You are the one that says you can define it, so you obviously have to know, but then finds all these holes in it. So this is kind of a very similar digression that, like, only because I'm the phony can I actually see the phoniness in all the other people around me.
Yeah. And to come back to cynics, if you're a modern day cynic, you can say, well, I know exactly what sort of thing you're going to get up to because I would be doing the same thing myself. Or maybe I'm too old or, I don't have the resources, but I would certainly be a bad guy, just like I know that you're a bad guy.
Yeah. And in part, it's counterproductive because there are people that actually do want to make things better, but if you are constantly,
opposing them, criticizing them,
and saying like, oh, you can't actually have any good intentions, that everyone's just out there to like get one over on everyone else, then there's nothing that's going to actually help bring us to this better world or this any sort of progress. And progress is impossible.
Yeah, and it risks a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you treat people as if they're going to lie, cheat, and steal, some of them at least are going to be like, well, you're already treating me that way, so I may as well behave that way if you give me the chance, And so you mentioned pessimism and nihilism. I think that this kind of conception of cynicism, you're right, it is aligned with those and also with what we can call misanthropy. So we probably need to say for the viewers what these actually are.
Yeah, so like pessimism here is, a general lack of hope and the belief that bad things will happen and that things will just get worse in general. Nihilism is the belief that there is no meaning to our lives, no inherent meaning, and that it's pointless for us to look for it. And then misanthropy is the disliking of humankind and avoiding human society in general.
Yeah, so those are all bad things, and there are a lot of people like that, but they're usually pretty miserable. I think there's some people who are kind of attached to those. They wouldn't want to give them up even though they're making them unhappy. But this doesn't have to be the kind of cynicism that we're advocating or looking at or delving into. This is only one modern contemporary use of the term, but there's a lot more to cynicism than that. And I think that cynicism is like a lot of other words. We've mentioned this in previous shows. Epicureanism doesn't mean stuffing your face like a pig. An Epicurean would actually be very measured in their intake of pleasant things. Stoics aren't unemotional. There are good emotions in Stoicism. And I think the same thing happened with cynicism somewhere down the line where what the ancient Cynics stood for became something quite different than what contemporary Cynics, if there is anything they stand for. Maybe it's purely negative, right?
Right. It's very history's version of the game of telephone.
One
person.
Yeah, you got to explain that for some of our listeners because I don't think they've played it.
The game of telephone is one person is told a thing at the very beginning of a line, and they have to then in turn whisper that into the ear of the next person in line, and that person then has to repeat this over and over until you get to the end. And the hope is, well, I don't know what the hope is exactly. The game is to see if you can actually get the information correctly passed from the first to the last person. And this also requires a modicum of trust that the people aren't going to just for the fun of it change them. And so, part of it is, you have competing schools, and sometimes there's someone from a competing schools that will straw man the other, and this will give us a bad conception of what these other schools actually are. And then someone comes down and reads this, and was like, "Oh, I don't have any other books that are talking about this, so this must be the true version of this thing," and just copies that, and that becomes the new definition over and over.
The people who write popular literature in like philosophy or culture in general are the worst for that. Like, I've found so many fake quotes on the internet, because I've gotten now like into trying to round them up and say, no, this is not by Epictetus, this is not by Aristotle. So many of them come from Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, which is still super, super popular. You go to any bookstore and you go to the philosophy section, and there it is, even though, Durant died a long time ago. And Durant will give you his takes on people, and sometimes they're accurate and sometimes they're not, and then somebody they'll harvest something out of his book and they'll present it as if this is what Aristotle said, or this is what Epictetus said, even though it's not even close. And I think that's part of what has happened with cynicism over the centuries. A great example of this is Nietzsche, who actually knew ancient philosophy quite well. He was a philologist. He writes in Beyond Good and Evil, he talks about, so-called cynics, those who simply recognize the animal, the commonplace, and the rule in themselves, and at the same time have so much spirituality and ticklishness as to make them talk of themselves and their like before witnesses. Sometimes they wallow even in books as on their own dunghill. Cynicism is, this is great. Cynicism is the only form in which base souls approach what is called honesty, and the higher man must open his ears to all the coarser, finer cynicism and congratulate himself when the clown becomes shameless right before him or the scientific satyr speaks out. So he's presenting cynicism as this, it's something that low-class people do, or low-class intellects engage in, and they wallow as on their own dunghill, a heap of crap. Right? That's what a dunghill is. And so that's what he takes cynicism to actually mean,
Yeah. And because you brought that up, it also, just before we fully step into this ancient cynicism, there are certain things in Thus Spake Zarathustra, in the three transformations of the spirit, when he talks about the process of being the cow, the one that just takes on all the burdens that are taken, that are given to us, and then the progression to becoming the lion, which is to try to slay the dragon of thou shalt. At least in this portion of it, this is actually very similar to some things that we're going to be talking about later. In the cynicism, that in the rejecting of social conventions, which in the way that is spoken in Zarathustra, you could absolutely call thou shalt, wear clothing, thou shalt use a bowl to drink from the river, thou shalt live in a house, thou shalt not
masturbate in the marketplace.
There you go. And so it's interesting, his disdain for it, but also his putting forward some of the ideas that the Cynics also came to.
Well, maybe that's a contrast between, again, the modern Cynic and the ancient Cynic, Somebody else who I thought we would, maybe bring up is somebody who's still alive, Peter Sloterdijk, who wrote a critique of cynical reason years and years and years ago. And he calls modern cynics borderline melancholics who can keep their symptoms of depression under control and yet retain the ability to work whatever might happen. And he says, indeed, this is the essential point in modern cynicism, the ability of its bearers to work in spite of anything that might happen. And so you get the idea that with some of the people theorizing about cynicism today, they view it as something that's going to inevitably arise within a late capitalist economy where, a lot of things are screwed up and things aren't what they pretend to be. I mean, think about the prevalence of advertising and marketing everywhere. And, cynicism is in part about tearing down the veils of things and showing them what they are, showing them as what they are. And at the same time, nothing changes by being a modern cynic. You're just kind of sniping at people, but it doesn't produce any significant change. Whereas the ancient cynics, boy, it was about changing who you were in really all across the board, right?
Yeah, although there is definitely when we're talking about ancient, we're really talking about like the Hellenistic Cynics, and we'll just get into them momentarily. But even by the Roman era, the Cynic name had gotten a tinge of rust added upon it.
I think that's in part because there were people who took advantage of the philosophy or the way of life to kind of do their own dirty little thing. And, you could wander around and beg and yell mean things at people and call yourself a cynic and get away with it. I mean, there's things like that today, right?
But the thing is that they were using it as a guise, but not actually walking the walk of an actual cynic. And so it already began to tarnish because there are people that took it up as this thing that they could use to dismiss any sort of criticism of them. It's like, oh, why are you being such a an asshole?
Or why are you being so lazy, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm just a cynic, and like, and that was their defense.
Yeah. I mean, you could say that it was kind of a shield in a way, calling yourself a cynic, as opposed to just saying, yeah, I'm just a lazy guy who doesn't like to do stuff, and like I don't bathe, and it's, I wander around from place to place because I'm offensive to people. I mean, there's a lot of people like that today who claim that they're like social critics, but they're just jerks too,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
let's get into the actual classics here.
Yeah, so, it's a philosophical school. There's a lot of important philosophical schools that arise as, we were saying in the Hellenistic, that means like later than the early Hellenic period, which would include Plato and Aristotle. We're talking about the time when the Greek city-states are basically losing their freedom and under the reign of, at first, the Macedonians and then, successor states. And eventually the Romans take all of that over. And, like a lot of the philosophies, it develops in Athens. And there's actually some debate among contemporary scholars about whether it really was a coherent school that had a lineage from Socrates himself, going through this guy Antisthenes, who I'm a big fan of, and then to Diogenes, and then, from one teacher to another. That might actually be made up. It might have been something that the Stoics kind of made up so that it gave them a lineage. But I don't know. I think that personally, I tend to think that Antisthenes really was a cynic, and he might have, taught Diogenes. And he's the guy that the school traditionally gets started with. And then there's a succession of teachers, and then a whole bunch of other people who glom onto it. And they also, like a lot of schools, like to read backwards and say, oh, by the way, before the school was actually started, there were other people who were living the life, this Scythian Anacharsis. They thought of Hercules as being like a typical cynic. Why? Because he wanders around, righting wrongs, and, he's basically just got a club and a lion, skin. And he's a tough guy,
Yeah.
Diogenes Laertes has this beautiful passage when he's talking about the Cynics, and he says, Antisthenes gave the impulse to the indifference of Diogenes, the apatheia, meaning not being moved by passions, the continence or self-control of Crates, who's also a Cynic, the and krateas, being able to control yourself, and then the hardihood of Zeno, who's the founder of the Stoics, the karterias, the endurance. And then he says something really interesting, laying the foundations of their state. And the word that's translated there as state is actually the word politeia, which means like political community. So they're being viewed as if they're part of not just a lineage, not just a way of life, but a community. And I think there's something kind of attractive to that, this idea that you and I, if we practice this, we could be not just like successors to Antisthenes or Diogenes, but we could be part of like a commonwealth that includes you and me and anybody else who wants to be like that,
Yeah. Yeah, to find communion, and they are also a little bit cosmopolitan here. They have a feeling of being part of a politic body that is of everyone. But I also wanted to add, these are once again another school as in philosophy as a way of life. This is kind of like one of the basic ideas of what we talk about in this particular radio show, that we're looking for practical philosophy, and this school, as well as the other ancient Hellenistic schools, are all looking for what does it mean to have a good life, and a lot of them are looking for what is this, a eudaimonic, what results in this eudaimonic and apathetic life that I guess not all of them are looking for the lack of negative passions, but at least every one of these are looking for the eudaimonic life, and they've come to a very similar position as a number of the other ones. They are school-based in virtue, just like you will see in the Aristotelians as well as the Stoics, and so we'll go a little bit more into that.
I'll say, too, that even the Epicureans, and they're kind of around the same time, Epicurus is arriving on the scene after Aristotle. So you could say that he's probably a contemporary of Crates, the third main Cynic guy. They seem to have thought that the virtues mattered. They just had a different reason for valuing them. They even thought friendship was a really important thing. And all the ancient schools seem to value friendship as well. So that's a good point, that there's a lot of overlap. The motivations are somewhat different, though. That's probably the key thing. So I did want to mention, for those of you who, and we're going to give you another reading recommendation later on of a really great book at the end, but where do we learn about these people? So all of these ancient Cynics, they actually wrote books themselves, and we know this because we have listings of these books that we no longer have, but we know not just from this guy, Diogenes Laertes, who was not a great philosopher but was a decent historian. We know from other people in ancient times who said, well, I read these books and here's what they said, and that's what, they were good or they were bad. But there's a lot of other interesting sources besides Diogenes. Xenophon, the student of Socrates, who was also a military commander, wrote a symposium in which Antisthenes is one of the characters and gives a speech and tells us about his way of life. Lucian of Samosata, who I'm a big fan of because he's a funny writer. He's actually a satirist. A lot of times he's poking fun not just at the Cynics, but all the other branches of philosophy. And he has in mind the jerk Cynics, right? The jackasses who we just talked about a little bit. But he also has a dialogue called The Cynic. And he lets the Cynic, a good Cynic, say his piece in it and present the philosophy. And there was a guy, apparently Demonax, who was a Cynic, and Lucian wrote a life of Demonax in which we learn a bit more about him. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, liked the Cynics quite a bit. He talks about Diogenes almost as much as he does Socrates, and he has an entire chapter of his discourses, and not a short chapter, a long chapter, which is about the Cynic way of life. And he's like, it's not for everybody, but if you can pull it off, go ahead and be a Cynic.
It's the shortcut to virtue.
Yeah, the royal road, sometimes they translate it as, meaning like it's the direct route rather than what we, rum-dums, ordinary people have to do, right? And then there's Dio Chrysostom. He writes a whole bunch of orations. He was a guy who had kind of a hard luck life and wound up being banished and wanders around, but does a lot of writing. And Diogenes is one of the guys who he writes about a lot. And maybe the stories are made up. Maybe they're true. We don't really know. There were Cynic letters or epistles that are definitely not by the ancient Cynics, but are, they're in their tradition, attributed to Diogenes, his student Crates, the guy we mentioned before, Anacharsis, Heraclitus. And then there was an emperor, Julian. sometimes called Julian the Apostate, because the Roman emperors by then were Christian, and he decided, I'm not being a Christian. I'm going to go back to the ancient Greek religion and do philosophy. And he has a bunch of orations that are about cynicism, including one to the uneducated cynics, where, again, cynics who are not real cynics, and he's saying, hey, you dirty bums, this isn't cynicism. This is what real cynicism looks like, So we have a lot of source texts, and, there's a lot we can learn by reading them. They are, of course, about ancient societies and cultures, so I think we have to do a lot of adapting work to make them fit our modern times. And obviously there's things like the internet or radio shows or, modern ways of dressing that they didn't anticipate. But there's a lot of great stuff contained in those works.
Yeah, that's a whole summer reading list in one go.
There is a place online, and I don't remember exactly where it is, where like all of these things and more are listed. I think it's somewhere on Medium, perhaps. One of the modern day cynics put it together.
Nice.
We'll see if we can track that down.
Now, the real question here is, what did the ancient cynics actually believe? And so we've talked about it a lot. And so the most important thing to the cynics is virtue. Once again, as we talked about it just a moment ago, virtue on schools. We have the Aristotelians as well as the Stoics. The Stoics, as we've talked about, Zeno was a student of a Cynic before he built his own school. And so what is virtue in the Cynic sense?
So, they recognize the same general virtues. You can think of these as like character traits that are recognized within ancient Greek society as important to develop in a person. And sometimes we talk about the cardinal virtues, wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, those were all recognized by pretty much all of these schools. The Cynics also talked about piety, which is, proper relation to the gods or to God. And then a term that's in Greek is megalopsychia, so you can translate it as great-souledness, but oftentimes we call it magnanimity, which is a tough one to say correctly. I've, practiced it recently, so I'm able to not screw it up. And it basically means the same thing, being like, the kind of person who's above it all. And, there's different construals of what exactly these mean, but they're all viewed as things that we need to develop within ourselves that we don't automatically have. It's a lot of times, I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here. You see people in the present day talking about like virtue ethics, and we're going to, teach virtue to kids and stuff like that. And then they just give them these flashcards that have these names on them, like wisdom and prudence and, generosity and stuff like that. And you know how much good that does those kids? Not a damn bit. Yeah. Because you're not telling them what these are. You're just saying you should behave this way and look this way. And a cynic would look at that and be like, that's garbage. You need to actually give them some education in what justice looks like, And, like you were saying, for the cynics, virtue is basically everything. You want to be virtuous. And if you don't have these virtues already, you got to cultivate them. And it's a lot of hard work, but there's a good payoff to it because it makes you use that word eudaimonia earlier. Actually, why don't you say, because I'm not going to assume that viewers have listened to, or listeners have heard previous things. What does eudaimonia mean?
So it's sometimes translated as either happiness or excellence. And so what it makes to be an excellent individual, what is a happy life, as well as what is a fully fulfilling human life.
Yeah. And it's going to go along with some other things like freedom, not being drawn into things that, as they would say, make you a slave. And this is actually a good jumping off point to talk about pleasure, right? Which is, I know, something that you wanted to get into.
Right. So think of like pleasure as this line, and we can like go upon this line at different points, and we can kind of find different schools that lie along this line of pleasure, from pleasure is the good to pleasure is not the good. And so at one end we have the Epicureans, where pleasure is the good, and so they seek the pleasure and avoid pain. So this doesn't mean specifically to be gluttonous all the time, because if you're gluttonous all the time, then you're going to have either going to be hungover or you're going to be over full, and these are actually painful states or unpleasant states, and so they want to remove those as well. But they do consider pleasure a good in and of itself. We have the Aristotelianism, and so some pleasures are good, but virtue is a better pleasure than just our sensational pleasures. And then we have the Stoics, which we've spoken about in the past, where pleasures are indifference and virtue is the sole good. And so once again, the Cynics share this latter part of it, that virtue is the sole good, but pleasure is not a good, specifically not even an indifferent, and that it can enslave those who seek it.
Yeah, and so this is a really important thing, I would say, in our time, because we live in a culture. I'm not going to say that we're soft, but we are constantly bombarded with opportunities for and suggestions that we partake in certain pleasures. I mean, if you think just about eating, right? If you were going to have a dessert in ancient times, most likely, if it was sweet, it was flavored with something like honey or figs or something along those lines. I mean, Europeans complain that things like spaghetti sauce here in the United States are too sweet, or the bread is too sweet, because sugar is added, or corn syrup is added to so many different things. And why? Because, it makes things kind of tasty. And we have, all sorts of other ways in which the drive for pleasure is constantly catered to. I mean,
supersize it.
Well, right, with food. But I was thinking about like streaming content, It used to be like, and now you're younger than me, so you tell me if you...
I still had a Blockbuster card.
Well, Blockbuster, right? But when I was a kid, there was cable. It existed, but we didn't have it. So you had like 4 or 5 channels. And, if a show came on, unless it was like a rerun, you had to wait for the new episode to come out. And if like you had an event that night, well, you missed it. And then the VCR came out. You could like record it if somebody was there to actually push the button, and then you could have like programmable ones. And then yes, we get Blockbuster and the capacity to get movies, and then TV shows in boxes, and then we get DVDs, and then pretty soon we get Netflix. And at first, Netflix is actually DVDs that come to your house. It's not streaming. And then we get streaming, right? And now it's no longer just Netflix, but it's also Hulu, and there's all these different streaming services. And now you can binge watch things constantly.
You don't even have to like hit next to watch the next episode or the next film. It's
That's right, yeah.
offered up to you.
So so with respect to those pleasures, we're kind of spoiled, right?
And the thing about also like how much like AC is a thing. Like, when I was a kid, that wasn't, at least in my experience, not a lot of people had it. That was a very kind of expensive nicety to have. And now it seems that we all have that.
There was one kid on our block whose parents had air conditioning. And you'd go over there and you'd be like, oh, it's so cold here, because the rest of us, we would just go down in the basement if it got too hot, or we just lived with it. So anyway, let's come back to pleasures. We talked about some other key ideas for the Cynics. One of the things that I think is really, really central is this rejection of social conventions and institutions. And this is one way they differ from the Stoics, who are in a certain respect like the Cynics, but a bit muted, a bit more toned down, right?
Yeah, they're there's pro-social to the point where there's like, okay, if there's something's really wrong, you bring something up.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's like, okay, these people are doing. I don't need to go and directly confront everyone because I don't think that they are not conforming as well as they should be not conforming.
Yeah. The Cynics, not quite so much, right?
So there's a number of stories of Diogenes, the Cynic, about him going into the marketplace and eating, which apparently was a big faux pas, that you shouldn't be eating in the marketplace. And they're like, why are you eating? It was like, oh, well, I was hungry. Why not?
And other things, too.
Yeah, well, you've already talked about the one of masturbation. So, yeah, that was the other one.
Yeah.
It's very well known.
He did other crazy stuff. I mean, he lived in essentially a barrel that he turned into a house. And there's a story about when there was a siege, he's rolling the barrel back and forth, and people are, what the hell are you doing? And he's like, well, everyone looks so busy. I wanted to look busy myself. He's trying to, give them a lesson by doing this.
And he would go up directly, and like there's a story of him like holding up a lantern saying, I'm looking for a good man, and shining it directly in their eyes. Are you a good man? It's like, that is directly confronting people about, what their actions are and why are they doing the things that they're doing.
Yeah. And so why did they do this? It wasn't just, well, I mean, some of them, perhaps it was just to be jerks. But officially, it was to show people that we should live a life that's not dictated to by customs or conventions. We should live out a natural human life. We should stick to human nature. And this required some real courage on their part, and also what they called shamelessness, a lack of embarrassment, a lack of the sense of shame where other people would feel this. There's actually a story, I think it's about Diogenes, where somebody says he wants to be one of his students, and he gives him a big fish to carry around through the marketplace. And the guy does it for a little bit, and then he's like, this is BS, and he throws the fish away. And Diogenes says, well, you threw away my friendship over the price of a fish. But it was really not about the fish. It was about the social embarrassment of looking like a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
But
this also has a number of benefits. One of the big social cohesions that we have is what's the group that we consider ourselves part of? And so okay, you shouldn't be even having this idea of that you're an Athenian, or you are a New Yorker, or you are I don't know, someone from London, a Londonite. Instead,
Londoner, I don't know.
Londoner. Instead, you should be a member of the world, of the whole cosmos. And this is, once again, cosmopolitanism. And so removing or rejecting this ethnocentrism allows you to actually be virtuous and not, make decisions along the lines of, what is the good being, what is good for the people I like, and bad things happening to the people that I don't like.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a real sense of humanity that it helps to encourage a identification with people regardless of the differences that they have with you, go ahead.
Well, it's just speaking of differences in how people have thrown off these old accoutrements that they had, especially of wealth, we should talk about Crates and
Hipparchia, yeah.
Hipparchia, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. So this is a really interesting couple. Crates was a student of Diogenes, right? So he's in the lineage. And Hipparchia, her brother, was a friend and student of Crates. And that's how they got to know each other. And Hipparchia was a very unconventional woman. She had arranged marriages lined up because her parents were trying to, follow convention. And she's like, nope, not that guy. Nope, not that guy. I want a guy who's actually into virtue and learning and, the important stuff in life, right? So already she's kind of a weirdo. And she meets Crates and she's like, that's the guy for me. And Crates is like, no, I'm not. Look at the life that I live. I don't have anything. I wander around all over the place. I beg for my food. this is not what you want, lady. And she's like, nope, that's exactly what I want. And she won't leave him alone until he agrees to marry her. And so in a certain way, this is really fascinating. It's a rejection of traditional marriage, right? And ways of living, being a householder, but they're definitely still married because they're having sex in public. You know, oh, go ahead.
Oh, just once again, that rejection of convention.
Yeah.
Where should you do that?
It's like that Beatles song, you know, should we do it in the road? You know, well, they did. Yeah. These are the original road doers. And we're pretty sure that she actually got pregnant and had at least one kid from these Stoic letters that may or may not be spurious, but certainly reflect traditions about them. And so what this shows you, I mean, to begin with, it's cool that she's a woman philosopher who's not just like in the proverbial ivory tower locked away. She's out there in the street with her guy, going around doing the Cynic thing, doing philosophy as a way of life. But it's also kind of cool that this is part of their tradition. And it goes back to Antisthenes. One of the things that he was claiming is both men and women can have virtue equally. You know, so she's showing, at least in a Cynic way, that she can do that.
Yeah. So another way to reject convention is to have very different ideas about wealth and poverty and what these things give you. And so definitely one of the main things is that they see that these material possessions actually make you a slave to them, and that only through poverty does one actually get, the ability to become totally free.
Yeah, and this is probably a hard one for people today, especially since we live in an economy where if you don't have a certain level of wealth and possessions, it's very difficult for you to do things with your life, right? If you're a street person, oftentimes people will walk up to them and get a job. Well, getting a job these days requires having access to the internet because you got to apply for most of your jobs online, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that wasn't the case back then. You could wander around and have a begging bowl, as ascetics often did, not just in ancient Greece, but in India and China and places like that. And not having to worry about the wealth that you have and how you're going to keep it and how you're not going to get robbed. That is freedom.
Right. Like they say that embracing poverty gives one invincibility, total freedom, and self-sufficiency. This also helps that if you're like in a Mediterranean climate.
Exactly.
It makes things a little bit easier in that regard. But if you're in a warm enough climate, it makes things much easier to have a really strongly ascetic lifestyle. I guess that's why you kind of see these in, both India and the Mediterranean and parts of China.
Yeah, that would be tough to do here in Wisconsin, I think, when it gets to be winter.
Mm-hmm. Or you could be like, if you're familiar with Tunnel Bob.
No, who's that?
So Tunnel Bob is a gentleman who lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and he lives in the steam tunnels of the UW University. So you can't get him out of him. He knows it like the back of his hands.
You get him out and he finds his way back in.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So he's like 6'5". He's a tall guy. He's easy to pick out. Older gentleman. I hope he's still alive. But he's just he's rather benign, but he just loves the tunnels, and I would call him quite a bit of a modern day ascetic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we should talk about asceticism. That's when we say that, we mean like a life of discipline or hardship. And the Cynics practiced this deliberately. And it wasn't just about poverty. It was also, trying to live a very simple life, doing activities that would toughen your body, like Diogenes would lay in the hot sun, and it gets pretty hot, in Greece. And then in the winter, he would hug statues to toughen up his body that way as well. And this is not just toughening up your body, it's also toughening up your mind, right?
Yes, but we're all getting rather close to cold showers.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a popular thing for Cynics and Stoics today.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a huge fan of cold showers for their own sake, or even for asceticism myself, because I don't like cold. But do you do those or?
I tried it for a second. They're nicer in the summer, obviously. It's cold enough in winter. I don't need to do it then. But yeah, like Crates is quoted as saying, "Philosophy is a quart of beans and a care for nothing." And Diogenes, Sinope or Diogenes the Cynic is also known for like he has this story about like him having a bowl to drink water from the river, and he sees this boy cup his hands and go and drink from the river, and he goes, "I'm being outdone by this boy," and throws away the bowl. This is very much their idea of what is it to live a good life. Live a good life in accordance with nature, and nature you don't need bowls. You can get the water as well with your hands as with the bowl.
Yeah, and they did have like an outfit that they were known for: a staff, a cloak, and usually kind of a worn out, old, smelly cloak, and what they call a wallet. They translate it as that. I think we would translate it as like a satchel or a pack, because you'd keep your cheese and your beans and stuff like that in there, and that was it. I mean, that's not an awful lot of stuff. It's not 5 suitcases that you somehow get on the train or into the airplane. It's just what you've got on you at the time. And, I remember times when I would go places and, obviously I would have like a wallet, that I would keep money in and cards in and things like that. But not having to care about all this other stuff, like where did I leave my car, that can be quite freeing, right?
Right. It had a cousin of mine who backpacked through Southeast Asia.
Oh wow!
With just a 5-gallon bucket, and he had a blog that was him just like bucket boy.
So no blanket, no sleeping bag, no.
Whatever he could fit into the 5-gallon bucket.
Oh, okay.
That is what he carried with him. Yeah. So it was just like try to reduce the things.
That's interesting. How far did he get?
Oh, he went all over. And now he's a banker in London. A lovely gentleman.
Well, going back to something that you remarked, just as a segue. So the quart of beans. Now, beans have a tendency, as all of the old versions, beans, the musical fruit, or beans, good for the heart. And you probably know the rest of the poem, so I don't need to recite it for you. But that was actually not a virtue, but that was a virtue of those things in the, more loose sense, because, it would lead to flatulence. And the Cynics were, they like to laugh, and they also like to. This is another way of sort of violating conventions. Is like you'd go somewhere and let one rip, and then everybody's not quite so serious after that. And this leads us into talking about their. It's translated as frankness or freedom of speech, parrhesia in Greek, right? Which means being able to say whatever the hell you want to. And this is something that was viewed as important. Like you notice that Plato in the Republic talks about this is one of the things that people think democracy consists in, being not just getting to vote, but getting to like say whatever the hell you want. Mm-hmm. But people didn't oftentimes say what they wanted, right? So being able to say the things that are on your mind, there's a freedom in that. But the Cynics went beyond that, right?
Yeah, they were right up in your face. Like we already talked about the, going up and asking, like, looking for a good man with a lantern in his hand. But they were all about really speaking truth to power, to like, really cutting down those people that thought that they were, the bee's knees, or holier than thou, however you want to put it, just because of their particular positions, and saying, like, why are you actually thinking that this thing is good? I'm going to rip this ideology or this thing a new one because you aren't actually thinking through this at all.
Yeah. And Plato was a particular target back then. Antisthenes went after him. Diogenes really went after Plato. I mean, it was like he saw him not as the enemy, but as like the main guy to razz.
Yeah, they would sometimes call the Cynics Socrates gone mad. And
right,
that,
yeah,
well, Socrates would go around and be the gadfly, and I guess you call the Cynics the horde of hornets coming around and not just needling, but like, making a pincushion of you.
There's a lot of good one-liners in Diogenes Laertes where Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynic, would go after Plato. Like Plato sees Diogenes washing vegetables, and is what you'd have to do to get your meal ready. And Plato says, if you'd gone and done some homage to Dionysus, this guy who was a local ruler, you wouldn't have to be washing cabbages or whatever it is. And then Diogenes says, yeah, and if you had washed some vegetables, you wouldn't have to go kiss the butt of this guy,
And another time, it goes, the philosophers are having a conversation, and I believe it's Plato that puts out this idea that a man is a featherless biped.
Yeah.
And Diogenes, the Cynic, hears this and goes and comes back with the plucked chicken, and he goes, "Behold, a man!"
Yeah, so I mean that's a good way to like show that Plato didn't really know as much as he was pretending to. It must have been kind of rough being Plato with those guys around. But it goes beyond just like being a jerk and a funny guy. They thought that this was good for everybody. There's this phrase that they're heralds of God, meaning that they're like announcing the best way to live, and they're haranguing people so that they can draw them to the good life. So there's almost like a medicinal property or function to it. Right. And like you said, Socrates was doing this himself, but he was doing it in a more like ironic, you're so smart. Show me how smart you are, Right? Yeah. The Cynics would instead get up and say, hey, dummy, you're not so smart as you pretend to be. And you see that there's a difference between those approaches.
Right. And one works definitely better for a crowd. And one works better for actually having a good interlocutor or someone that you're actually trying to have a dialogue with to actually like come to change minds. Because most people, once you like yell at them and say like, "Oh, you're so dumb," they're not going to be changing their mind. They're going to like harden their position against that thing.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure that, and we hear about sort of like the successes of the Cynics. I'm sure there were a lot of cases where they got the worst of things. And we should talk briefly before we talk about our practice so we started out talking about modern day cynicism. There are people in the present who actually are trying to live a way of life that is faithful to the Cynics of 2,000 plus years ago. And they have, a Facebook group called the Kunosarges, named after the gymnasium where the Cynics would supposedly meet. And there's, all sorts of websites out there. It's not as big as, say, the modern Stoic or modern Epicurean movement, but it exists, And I think that we could ask, are there other groups or types that kind of fit in with this? Maybe the old-fashioned hippies and other like get back to nature types are kind of like the Cynics, but kind of not like them, But we could also say, and I'm kind of curious to see what you think about this, Dan. What about what people these days call minimalism, where you try to reduce your possessions and uncomplicate your life, but within a modern framework. Does that, it doesn't have the, I'm going to go out and harangue people aspect to it. And it doesn't necessarily tie in with virtue, but do you see that as similar to cynicism?
I think it has some of the trappings thereof.
Okay.
But there's you don't have anything about virtue. You don't have anything about going back to nature, because most of these people live in apartments with very few things.
Yeah.
And part of it is you live in an apartment, so you don't have to have a yard to deal with and whatnot. And so
right.
This requirement, there's a certain amount of things that other people are doing for you. This requires that. So I guess is, if you want to call it kind of close in a modern day sense of things, under what our system allows, maybe, but
okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not fully there. No.
Yeah. I kind of think you're right that there are some dissimilarities. So it's like a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, but there's some stuff that's not there. So, you want to lead us into the practice? Very cynic practice?
I hope I won't be too cynical when I'm talking about it. So, rejecting convention. So we talked about this as one of the main things that the Cynics tried to do in order to try to get back to actual nature. And so the Cynics openly and intentionally walked a contrarian path. The reason was twofold. First, to try to adjust their own mindset away from following convention. And secondly, to force others to confront the reasons they themselves conform to that mindset. So we can go and do something, contrarian. So, I don't know.
I like this one.
We can walk backwards down the street. I'm thinking now of the Ministry of Silly Walks. Monty Python. That would be another way to wear a onesie pajamas in the mall. Anything that will break up the right way of doing anything. So got any of that come off your mind, Greg?
Well, first of all, picturing the onesies, there was always, is it truly a onesies, or does it also have the back flap thing? Right? You can leave that open, right? I don't know.
You're going super cynic.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things you could do. I was just thinking, there's so many things where we've gotten used to doing them this way, and this is just the way it is, and we expect people to do things that way. And we might also be a little bit afraid of social ostracism, social criticism, or getting filmed or something like that. Maybe actually filming yourself doing something like that could be an add-on to it.
The question is, though, I was actually thinking about this, that if you're doing it to film to put out for social media, now why are you doing this? Are you doing this to try to break your social convention? Or are you just doing this to get views? Well, so the intention would be required to be scrutinized as well.
Yeah, and I think both of the ones that you brought up could work, right? It could be to try to get yourself out of that groove that you're in, but also to show others that we don't have to do things this way. So, yeah. Now, we do have one book recommendation because we're getting close to the end for you, and it's a contemporary book, very short one, but it's really quite good. Ansgar Allen's recent, I think it's 2020 book, just called Cynicism, and we'll add a link to a book review video about it that I did a while back. Do you want to lead us out on a final quote then, or?
Yeah, so we leave you today with the words of Asceticism. Wisdom is a most sure stronghold, which never crumbles away nor is betrayed. Walls of defense must be constructed in our own impregnable reasonings.